Kind. Thank you very much. It's lovely to meet all of you. And Cynthia tells me that there may be some other folks viewing this later, which is the whole point of recording it. So for those of you who are here or watching it later, it's lovely to meet you. If I introduce myself briefly, I grew up in Montreal. Now I've lived in New York for 20 years. I'm back in the countryside, so hopefully the internet connection will be good, but east of Montreal right now. And I've had this role for the last 10 years at BCG. I've been with the firm 18, but for the last 10, I've focused entirely on creativity in the business world, which is a fantastic treat to actually, hi Carolyn, to actually focus full-time on creativity in the business world with clients really around the world across industries. Cynthia, at the same time, has been amazingly helpful in matching so many of our BCGers with worthy nonprofits. And when she was starting this new thing called Directorate, was, well, none of us can ever say no to her. So I was super excited actually to be able to talk with people like you about this. Because I didn't know how many people were joining, and because I'm a consultant, I'm going to project some slides. However, they are not typical consultant slides once we get past the agenda page. I'm going to show you a bunch of cartoons, I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures, and my hope it will be a way to get across some of the points I want to make. But I also hope that none of you will hesitate to chime in and ask questions or just make it a discussion at any point. Cynthia, if you can kindly allow me to share my screen, because I think right now it's disabled. Don't worry.
That's what we were supposed to be doing in prep time.
All good.
Okay,
We chat instead. That's okay.
You should be good now.
Great. So let's not let that stop us from getting started. The hypothesis for everything I'm about to say is very simple. All of us have at some point in our lives, in our careers, been invited to be creative. And all of us have in some way done a brainstorm, an ideation session, a creative session, whatever you want to call it. And most of us, I think, have been frustrated with how that works, because it's probably fun for 2-3 hours and you might wallpaper a room with flip charts or post-its or a virtual room, and then often it goes nowhere. And so this book that I wrote that Random House put out 8 years ago called Thinking in New Boxes, the idea is, how can we go beyond these failures? How can we go beyond just thinking outside the box as we've been exhorted to do for decades? And how can we actually find useful new boxes instead? So what I want to get at is why thinking creatively about the future is so difficult for most of us when we do these things, and just share some of my favorite approaches. And if we do it in an interactive way, it'll be more fun. So with that, the first cartoon I wanted to just put up is something that reminds me, maybe it reminds you of, frankly, everything in the last 16 months, where we all have, 53 hours of Zoom meetings a day while simultaneously multitasking and juggling a lot of things and all the rest of it. So it's one of my favorites. Hopefully it resonates with some of you as well. I recognize that you have 50 something hours of Zoom, WebEx, or whatever this week. And so my hope is that this will be one of the more fun hours, and we'll see how we go with that. So what I want to achieve then, a quick warm-up exercise, just to get in the spirit of interactivity. Why don't we do chat for this one? Just type a number into the chat. What is the probability that 5 years from today, you have to pay to do a Google search? You have to pay to do a basic Google search. What's the probability that that happens? Just type a number into the chat. What is the probability that 5 years from now, you have to pay to do a simple Google search? So Kirsten has direct messaged me with a 10. Anyone else going to put a number into the chat? 0. Okay, a couple of zeros. All right, fine. 0 is a common answer. Sometimes people hedge their bets and say 0.001, whatever. Okay, fine. 5, 10%, 25, excellent. Second question. Imagine that it is July 2026, 5 years from now, and you do have to pay to do a Google search. How did it happen? And now you can just unmute and shout it out. How did we get there? Give me a hypothesis of how the world got to that state. Any bright ideas?
Monopoly.
Okay, Monopoly, they have the best algorithm, they can charge whatever they want, fine. Someone else?
Searches are too generic right now.
they're too generic right now, so they come up with some cool new algorithm that makes them awesome, and then they can charge what they. Okay, what else? Another hypothesis?
Maybe confidentiality.
Okay. Yeah, I see some stuff in the chat around privacy, confidentiality, and Caroline arguing that we're paying for it already by giving our data for free. So later we'll get paid for that. Okay, fine. What else? Other hypotheses? Government regulation?
Yeah, regulation.
Yeah, government's going broke, so they have to tax companies like Google, and therefore Google has to pass that on to us, or some other sort of regulatory thing. What else? Any other bright ideas?
Your approach where you still got the free search, but then you had to pay more if you wanted the premium.
Okay, fantastic. A tiered version, fantastic. Okay, the other answer that I was sometimes thinking about is energy prices. You know, they have these massive server farms all over the place. If energy prices skyrocket, maybe they have to pass that cost along somehow. Okay, so yeah, subscription, also another option, Caroline in the chat. Fantastic. Okay, so we have a lot of answers to this question. Here's the point. With a group of 20-25 people anyway, if we were more statistically significant, if I asked you the first question again, what is the probability tomorrow, on average, your answers would change. And that's really interesting to me, because your answers would change not because I would have given you more facts about data or a 100-page research report about Google or whatever else, but purely as a result of 60 seconds of wild hypothesis generation. The point I'm making is that sometimes taking a minute to think prospectively about what might happen can actually change our answers to the very deductive logical ability type questions, which is kind of the stuff we face all day at the office or as board members. When we think about these things all day long, actually sometimes taking a minute to think creatively can stretch our perspectives enough to actually change our deductive analytical side. And so what I wanted to share, and this is now the sort of, I'm going to give you the 1-2 minute version of the first few chapters of the book, just to save everybody some time. But what I want to get at here is, if we imagine the world in front of us in all of its glory, our companies, the organizations we're on boards of, our families, our cities, society, everything, the claim I'm going to make is that all we do all day long is we take that and we simplify it into boxes or mental models or concepts or words for these things. But in essence, we take the world and we simplify it into these mental models that we then use to go and face the world in front of us. So if, for example, we have this mental model that says the rainbow has 7 colors, that's a useful oversimplification of the infinite number of colors that are actually there. And in the business world, it's exactly the same thing when you think about a market segmentation. Segments, it's a deliberate and useful oversimplification of hundreds of millions or billions of customers actually there. So to me, the interesting bit is the 2 arrows, because the 2 arrows represent all of the thinking that we do all day long. The bottom arrow is this deductive, logical, analytical type of thinking where we use our existing mental models. And so when we say, what is the probability of X, you're simply going into your mind to all of your thoughts about Google and whatever else and spitting out a number, 0 or 10% or whatever else. But when I ask you, imagine it did happen, how did it happen? It feels different. It's an invitation to find a new mental model, a new box, to reorganize things in your brain, to think about how might this happen. It's the invitation to be creative. So that's what I wanted to get at, this business of inductive, creative thinking, of finding new mental models instead of just using our existing ones. That to me is the preamble to everything we could talk about for the next hour, because if we understand a little bit about how we think and how thinking creatively is different from the deductive analytical type that takes up most of our time, it's a good start. I want to give you one business example of this, and then we'll go to some more cartoons and some examples from history and see where we go. The business example, which I love because it's so beautiful and simple, is BIC. BIC, this French pen company, was founded after the Second World War by Marcel Bic. And for 30 years, they made only pens. And so then they had an offsite where they gathered the top leaders of the company in some chateau outside Paris. And they said, okay, guys, we need some new ideas for growth. We need some new ideas for our company. And they came with these ideas like that 4-colored pen and the erasable pen and a pen that says, you know, Hilton or Marriott or what. Okay, so they come with a lot of great ideas. And then somebody says, hey, we can make razors. Why don't we make plastic razors? And the reason I love this is because, look, now 45 years after that event, we all know that Bic made a ton of money off of cheap plastic disposable razors and lighters and stuff like that. But if I ask you, what was the reaction? I mean, imagine you were all in that meeting at that time. We're the 10-person executive team of Bic. What would be your reaction when your colleague suggests, why don't we make these cheap plastic razors? How do you react to that?
Negative.
Negative. Go on,
Now
say
or
more,
3
Stephen,
years
if you
ago,
will.
I mean, now the way I react to it now is like, well, that's a lot of plastic. And what do
Yeah.
you do when it just gets disposed? I mean, I wasn't thinking like that 30 years ago for sure, but
No, indeed. Indeed, that's a separate question, this business of sustainability. But in that meeting then, your first reaction is very likely to be like what Stephen said, negative. This is not what we do. This is not who we are. This is not our core competency, whatever word you want to use. C'est pas possible, whatever you say, you know, this is not our business. And yet they did make a ton of money off this stuff. And so the claim I will make then, putting aside how sustainable it is, because that's a great point too, the claim I will make is that everyone in that room had this mental model of a company, and this is a perfectly reasonable mental model to have, to be in that box. And if you're in that box, then 4-colored pens and erasable pens are great ideas, and razors are ridiculous ideas. That's not who we are. But if you can change that box, and instead of saying we are a pen company, maybe say we are a plastic object company, or we are an inexpensive consumer goods company, or, well, there's a lot of ways to say it. But if you can change that overarching box, basically go round in that circle and update your mental model from pen company to plastic object company, then it's a perfectly good idea. So the point is, the same idea went from being a ridiculous idea to a perfectly good idea, not because anything changed about the idea, but because one of our mental models changed. We changed the way we look at that thing. The other way to interpret this is that Bic actually didn't invent anything new. On the right side of this equation, nothing changed because Gillette was already making cheap plastic razors. So there was no new invention in the world. The only thing that changed was in their mental models. And if you change that, you can open the door to a lot of new things. So that's one point I wanted to make. The corollary of that from a New Yorker cartoon is this couple telling their cat, never ever think outside the box. And I guess the point I'd be making with this, you know, we've been exhorted for decades to think outside the box when we want to be creative. But if you're with me so far, it means you understand that we can't help thinking using boxes. We always think using mental models. And so saying think outside the box isn't good enough. It's basically like saying, well, your existing boxes are no good. But this is why I get to, let's go beyond that. Let's find some useful new boxes for what we're trying to achieve. So I want to give you 2 examples from history, and then I'm going to pause for a moment and we can have a discussion. The first one from history, this is a recruiting ad for the Pony Express from 1860, 160 something years ago. And well, it's the precursor of the Postal Service, but basically their recruiting ad, they were making a bit of a joke, wanted young skinny fellows, must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily, orphan preferred. Okay, so if you show this to anyone in HR, of course, they will have a lot of distinct allergic reactions to this thing, around the not over 18, around the wages, but certainly the orphans. Anyway, okay, you get the point. But if I asked a random person on the street in 1860, what does the Pony Express do? What is their business? You know, Bic is a pen company. This is a bank. What does the Pony Express do? How would they say what the Pony Express does in a couple of words? What's their business? Anyone?
Adventure.
transfer information,
Yeah.
transport.
Yeah. Transport, or even more simple. I mean,
Deliver mail.
delivering packages. is. Deliver from A to point B. What about today? If I pick a random person on the street in New York or Montana or wherever else and say, what about the US Postal Service? Jokes aside, you know, if one were asked to describe their business, what do? It's kind of the same, right? I mean, in 120 years, plus or minus Amazon, but it hasn't really changed. So they didn't have this moment like Big had from going from pens to plastic objects. This is opening the aperture. Google went from search engines to we want to know everything, or we want to organize the world's information is how they say it. So that opens the door to Gmail, Google Earth, Google this, whatever. Okay. And you can have other companies that expand it or even contract it. You know, Danone, for example, another French company, they started off by saying, we want to make good quality food. And they switched that to, we want to make food that's good for you. And so they sold off their beer division, they sold off their cookies and biscuits and stuff, and they focused on the water and yogurt and how we know them today, baby food, things like that. But the point I'm making is the Pony Express, the US Postal Service, had none of those things. Their big overarching box stayed roughly the same for 120 years, and that's a bit less normal. But all the other boxes changed. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because it's not just about the big, grandiose, overarching box of we are a pen company or whatever, but we have many, many other boxes. Like, this is how we think about our customers. This is how we think about the competition. And in their case here, the transportation changed from ponies to trucks and planes. The zip codes changed, the pricing changed, the location of post offices changed. Definitely the HR policies changed. So the point I'm making is everything changed about this business except the big, grandiose, overarching box. And when we think about the work that we do, or when we work with nonprofit, whatever the case may be, we have many, many, many boxes, not just the big grand one of who they are, but how we do things, how we use technology, who's the competition. All of these are mental models, and finding ways to challenge one or more of those can open the door to a lot of things. So then, fast forward 40 or so years, now we're in the beginning of the 20th century. How does that actually happen? How do we actually change some of our boxes, come with new ones? This is something called an ornithopter. And this image is from just before the Wright brothers invented what we think of as the first airplane. So how would you describe this thing? Just in looking at the picture, what words would you use to describe an ornithopter?
Has wings.
Okay.
Looks
Has
like
wings.
a bicycle.
What else? Yeah, looks like an attempt to fly like a bicycle. Yeah, what else? I see in the chat wings to fly. Yeah, okay.
Mechanical.
Fine. It looks, yeah, mechanical bird. Fantastic. Thank you. So mechanical bird, flying bicycle, an attempt to, okay, so all of these are right. It didn't work, by the way. This thing was a total failure. It crashed and burned, basically. People were tinkering with it for a long time, but it never really worked. And yet, if you can imagine living in a world where the airplane hasn't been invented yet, and I know maybe some parts of the last 16 months, all of us flew a lot less than normal, but imagine the airplane hasn't even been invented yet. It's not stupid, this idea. Right? I mean, if you imagine we're human beings, we're a curious species, we look out the window, we see a bird flying, we say, okay, I want to fly too. So we make a machine that imitates the bird. We make a machine that basically operates by flapping its wings like a bird. So it's not irrational, it's not wrong, it's not stupid, it just doesn't work. So how do you go from that, from this ornithopter, to the actual first airplane, which, you know, when you think about it, doesn't involve flapping wings. It involved airflow and physics, and you have to think a lot about that. But what I'm trying to say is that a bird and an airplane do not fly in the same way. They have a different physical mechanism. And so if you want to invent the airplane, you have to be willing to let go of the bird. Or put differently, if you want to invent the airplane, you have to be willing to let go of the mental model that says things fly by flapping their wings. Or put more generally for us, if we want to think creatively about what's possible in the future, we have to be willing to let go of some of our mental models or boxes about what is and what has been. It doesn't mean throwing away all of our existing mental models. Some of them might still serve us well for a long time. But if we want to think creatively about what's possible in the future, we have to be willing to let go of some of those men about what is. Otherwise, we can never go from flapping wings to this sort of thing. So if I flip away from the images and cartoons for a moment and just back to the sort of BCG slide about this to try and sum it all up, what I've been saying so far. If you ask some random person on the street, what is creativity in business? They might say, coming up with new ideas, and that's fine. You can have new product ideas, new business models, new ways of doing things. That's not wrong. But if you're with me so far, my claim is that that's incomplete, because actually coming up with new ideas is only part of it. Changing the way we look at existing ideas is also part of it. Changing our existing ideas that say we are a pen company or things fly by flapping their wings can also be part of it. And in that sense, but also changing the way you think about this customer, changing the way you think about who you are, changing the way you think about the competition or the facts or how we do things, these processes, how we use technology, whatever. And the corollary to that is that you can have a fantastically creative brainstorm or creative session without a single new idea, as long as you're willing to challenge existing ones. As long as you're willing to look at existing ideas in new ways, or what you do in new ways, you can have a fantastically productive session without a single new idea. So that's a good place for me to pause. I've been talking for a while and asking you some questions and showing you some pictures. I can go on and share some of my favorite techniques for how to bring more creativity to our organizations, but it's a good place for me to just pause and check. Are you with me so far? Any questions, any challenges? Don't be shy. It's a great moment.
Good.
Is
Okay.
theory of change a wholly deductive exercise, or can it help this creativity?
I lost your first two words. Can you just say it again, Jenny?
Is theory of change a wholly deductive exercise, or can it add to this creative?
Thank you.
Ferment?
I love the question. I would say that I think creativity is absolutely relevant. You know, putting a theory of change in place is one thing. Allowing yourself, allowing a board, allowing an organization to challenge that theory of change and rethink it in the face of new technology, changing environment, whatever other uncertainties may be facing, you know, allowing oneself to think creatively about which pieces of the theory of change, which underlying assumptions might be ready for a change. Yeah, to me, it's not a wholly deductive exercise. It's a beautiful opportunity to challenge some existing mental models as well.
Alan, I think this is particularly relevant for nonprofits in that nonprofits get there are a lot of sort of institutional reasons why they have creativity issues. One is a big one is their funders are constantly saying to them, I feel mission drift coming on. There's mission drift. We funded you to do this specific thing this specific way. And so I find that nonprofits will often use that as an excuse for not thinking creatively. Whereas then once you come up with these fresh approaches, then it's your job to sell it to your donors if that's the right solution. And so, I feel like board members, like the people who are listening today, it's their responsibility to help. That's one of the biggest ways you can help as a board member, is to help the organization from the very top down, think more creatively, and then say, hey, we've got this covered. We will help you sell this to your funders if this is the right way to fix this problem.
It certainly resonates for me. The idea of, we all have many, many, many mental models or boxes that we use, and many of them are hidden or implicit, taken for granted. And so taking the time to surface those and maybe make them more explicit and clear, I have seen be a really useful thing for nonprofits, to say, not just that, okay, well, we've been helping people in the Bronx for the last 20 years, but we are going to very deliberately focus on the Bronx and not expand to Brooklyn and Philadelphia, even though they might need it too. We are going to deliberately focus on using the arts as a means to help build community rather than expand into other areas of building community, and just acknowledging what are our existing assumptions, especially the hidden ones, and why. And yes, okay, changing them over the course of time, having a vision exercise, rethinking these things, fine. Periodically we can do that. But taking the time to actually acknowledge the existing assumptions is a really powerful thing that people often skip.
Kirsten, without mentioning the name of the particular board that you were involved in where you did this, Kirsten did something incredibly creative for one of the boards on which she sat, where they were having real budget issues. And again, in the nonprofit community, they're always, focused on like, how are we going to make the budget work? Who are we going to have to fire, and how are we going to cut costs? And rather than, they were very focused there. Kirsten said, let's instead focus on additional revenue. It was a board that had a revenue stream, and part of the services they offered didn't come with a revenue stream. And then she spent, as I recall, hundreds of hours interviewing all the different departments, finding out where there was this really great revenue stream that they were not offering enough of, that people were very happy to pay for. Which, do you want to talk about that, Kirsten, without using names, because I know it's private? But what you did there was, I thought, extraordinarily creative. Everybody was so focused on the other side of the equation.
Well, I think I know what you're talking about, Cynthia. Thank you. I think it was, we were looking at they thought they were a facility that provided, lessons and things, and we said, you're more like an airline in that you have seats. And some are more valuable, like a lesson in the middle of the day is, less, it should cost less than lessons given after school. And so you've got to sort of think about how you're selling those seats, So it was financial, but it was thinking about the business model in a different way, if that's what you're referring to, Cynthia.
And as I recall, you generated something like $450,000 a year of additional revenue with that. And this was like 15 years ago. So that's like $4.5 million now. But
yeah. Well, we said, you don't need old ladies, using up the facility after school. They can go in the morning. Parents will pay a lot more to have their kids do it when they do it. So yeah, I think, I don't know, I didn't feel that creative, but for the staff, it was having them think about how they program in a different way.
I just want to say this isn't limited to nonprofits. One of my favorite peeves is the continual assumption that the private sector somehow is better. When in fact, I think the nonprofits, given that they operate in such constraints, are often very agile. But I worked as the CFO for a digital health company that was literally bankrupt. And none of the sales force thought that they could get their end customer to pay for their product. They thought they had to bundle it and give it away. And only in the face of utter ruin did they go to their customers and say, I'm going out of business if you don't pay for this. And lo and behold, the customers were willing to pay for it.
Mm.
They didn't believe their value add till they were almost dead.
Well, look, it certainly resonates with me. I mean, the reason I've been able to focus on this for 10 years and counting at BCG is because there's plenty of corporations that need more support on this. So I have no argument, including healthcare, but every other industry as well. Completely with you. Maybe I'll share my favorite exercise for how to get going with this, because I think what I've said so far is some of the theory of what it means to think in new boxes. But when I get stuck on a problem, my favorite exercise, which I just need a blank sheet of paper to try, or iPad or wherever you write notes, is really about systematically trying to take some of the mental models that I have and think which ones might be ready for a change. But that's very theoretical. So let me give you an example. low-cost airlines. We just talked about airlines on and off, or the Ornithopter, so I'm in airline mode. Imagine when the first low-cost airline was created, which was Southwest. How did they actually do it? And I'll give you the oversimplified answer from my perspective. They took some of the mental models inherent in the mind of everyone in the airline industry, and they thoughtfully challenged them. So everyone in the airline industry would have said, we need many different types of planes, big planes and small planes to serve different routes. They said, no, we're going to have one type of plane because it's cheaper. Okay, but that's not enough. We use travel agents. We're not going to use travel agents. Well, that was quite heretical. We have assigned seats. We're going to have open seating. We have all-inclusive pricing. We're going to have unbundled pricing and charge extra for everything. We have a hub and spoke model. We're going to have a point-to-point model. We fly to primary airports that are convenient near the big city. We're going to fly to secondary airports that are further out because it's cheaper. We consider safety our #1 top priority. Let's keep that one. Actually, that one's okay. So, you know, it's not a question of deliberately throwing away all of your existing mental models just because they're there, but of systematically trying to list some of your assumptions and think, okay, what if we challenge this one? And in the end, okay, they changed the travel agent one, but not the safety one. And that's fine. But going through that, I love the idea of 5 minutes with a blank sheet of paper focused on whatever problem you're facing and just doing that in from to exercise with the low-cost airline as an analogy, or whatever other analogy we use, from pens to plastic objects, and just thinking, which of my current assumptions relative to my problem might be ready for a change. It's a really powerful exercise to start with. So if that's one, you know, if that's one of my favorite exercises, I can share a few more. And again, don't be shy to chime in with any questions, and we can have more discussion in a moment. But why don't I take a few minutes and share some of my other favorite exercises? And let me just turn these things back on. So the premise of the book, in one BCG slide, and I'll go back to pictures shortly, you know, every time we've done any creative exercise in the business world, we've been told, okay, you have to have divergence and convergence. You have to diverge where you get a lot of ideas on the table and withhold your judgment, and then you converge and prioritize and select. And the claim I've been making, which I think you're with me with so far, is that that's not enough. You have to actually start with doubt. Rather than just saying, okay, smart people, here's some snacks, here's some flip charts, come with a lot of ideas. You have to actually start before that and understand what are some of your existing ideas and which of them might be ready for a challenge. So when I get at doubt, what I mean by that is acknowledging we're human beings who see the world in a certain way, and that it can be powerful to actually doubt some of our existing assumptions. Our biases come into that too. I mean, this is a beautiful demonstration of the confirmation bias, where we see what we want to see. In this case, these two gents. Anyway, I don't have to explain it, but understanding our biases, being willing to doubt some of our ways of looking at the world, can be a super powerful thing. Which takes me to my second of my favorite exercises for how to do this, which is actually challenging the way you're asking the question in the first place. There's a story of a landlord who was getting a ton of complaints from her tenants about how long it was taking the elevators to arrive. And as the story goes, she started investigating the options. And okay, well, for $1 million, I could just replace the whole system, which is a bit antiquated. For 200,000, I could, I'm making up the numbers here, I could install that cool new algorithm where you just punch in your floor number and it assigns you to an elevator car, and that should help the efficiency of the whole system. And then in the end, for 400 bucks, she sticks a mirror in front of the elevators in the lobby, and the complaints dip to 0. So the point I'm making here, obviously what you understand is that by putting the mirror there, people focus on their appearance and they're no longer bothered by how long it takes the elevator to arrive. This is why even before COVID, you would see the sanitizer dispensers at elevator lobbies, or a newspaper laid out there, whatever, to take your time off take your mind off how long it's taking the elevators to come. But for creativity, the point I'm making is this: if the question you're asking is, how can we minimize the number of seconds till the elevator arrives? Well, that's a legitimate question, and there's a lot of legitimate answers to it. But if the question you're asking is how can we minimize the complaints about how long it takes the elevator to arrive, it sounds like it's the same question, but it's not. It leads to completely different answers. And in this case, my answers, just by ask the question. But you get the idea. And what I'm getting at here is even doubting the way asking the question, doubting some of your assumptions, doubting, is the question you're asking really, what if you take it from a customer perspective? What if you take it from a different perspective? What if you try and describe it in a more evocative way? A lot of these things can be really powerful, just changing the way we ask the question. So if we can manage that, then what we love to do when we're tackling any question in the corporate or nonprofit world is gather the facts and the data and all the rest of it. And I think what this cartoon is really to demonstrate is that when it comes to gathering the facts and data, there can be multiple legitimate, correct ways of interpreting the information. Whether it's trends or customer research or competitive intelligence or just this image, there can be multiple legitimate ways of interpreting the same facts. Doesn't mean alternative facts. It means alternative ways of interpreting the facts. And the reason that's interesting is, when you have multiple board members looking at the same data, when you have multiple bosses maybe looking at this information, there's no guarantee that we all look at it in precisely the same way. And so being willing again to acknowledge that our way of looking at the facts is one way and that the penguin or whoever may have another is a powerful thing. So if you can manage that, then it gets to the actual brainstorm where you have to withhold your judgment and not decide too early which are the good ideas, which are the bad ideas. And you can remember that no idea is born good. And so here where it says first prototype of the labyrinth, the point is if you think about the first prototype of Twitter or the mobile phone or whatever else, the first prototype is very rarely the final answer. And so what I'm getting at is when it comes to getting a ton of ideas on the table and withholding judgment, there's a lot of ways to do it, but in the end, they're all the same because they're about changing perspective, trying new analogies. Put differently, if there's an infinite number of ways to run a brainstorm, they're all the same because they're all about some of these assumptions of how our mind works. So if we want to avoid the boards we sit on or the organizations we work with being places like this, where people just say, well, we can't do that because it's never been done before. If we want to avoid that, we get to this list of my favorite ways of getting new ideas on the table. The first one I've already discussed, shifting mental models from to, like in the low-cost airline example. The second one, asking the question in a new way, like the elevator, we've already discussed as well. Maybe I'll share the third and fourth and then pause again for more questions and we can keep going. But the third one is trying to describe the problem without using any of the keywords. So what do I mean by that? If I ask some random person on the street, what is Starbucks? Their answer is obviously going to be, well, it's a coffee shop, or it's a chain of coffee shops, or some such thing. But if I ask any of you, what is Starbucks? And I tell you, you're not allowed to use the word coffee or Java or tea, because this is not an exercise in finding synonyms. You're not allowed to use any of those obvious keywords. How might you describe Starbucks? Any bright ideas? How would you describe Starbucks without using any of the obvious words? I see Jenny in the chat, a communal office. Thank you for that. What else? So my office, a place to do my work. What else? You can unmute anyone.
A place to socialize, a place to socialize with friends.
Socialize, place to hang out, a place to meet people, socialize. Sure, absolutely. What else? Something different from those?
A snack or something to drink.
Fine. A place to get a snack.
To relax,
what else?
an indulgence. I think it's an affordable indulgence.
An indulgence, yes. Fantastic.
An invigorating beverage made the way I like it.
An invigorating, customized beverage made the way I like. Yes, okay, fantastic. A place to go get free Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
A place to go get a free toilet. I don't know. What else?
An exemplar of
So the point.
an employer with benefits that exceed others.
Okay. Great. An employer with good benefits. Someone put in the chat just to me, a low-risk meeting place for a first date, for online dating. Sure, fantastic. Okay, so we can keep going. We can get a lot of things, but the point I'm making is, if you were thinking of Starbucks as a coffee shop, and I said, come with new ideas, well, then you say, okay, you can have a bigger and smaller cup. You can have peppermint spice, pumpkin spice. You can have Madagascar or Costa Rica beans. I don't know what. But now, if you start thinking about it in some of these other ways, like the first thing we said, an office, a place to do my work. What other ideas come? Well, okay, maybe I should install printers and sell printing for $1 a page, or I should have meeting rooms available for rent in the back in select locations, or whatever. Or if it's a meeting place or a place for dates, maybe I should sell the music. You know, they started selling CDs 15 years ago. There's a lot of ideas now coming up that have nothing to do with coffee. And that's really interesting. So the idea that I'm getting at is sometimes describing the problem without using keywords can be a beautiful way to open the door to new possibilities and new ideas. Frankly, if you told big people in 1975 to describe their business without using pens, they might have gotten to plastic objects even more quickly, but none of us were there. So that was my third suggestion here. Another of my favorites is just taking a different perspective. And this is something I do with clients all the time. A common approach to doing this is take a different stakeholder or customer perspective. But it's not just what would it take to delight this 73-year-old retired person who's not awesome at digital, but is one of our big customers, or this 26-year-old gadget happy graduate student, or this 34-year-old single mother, or whoever our customers or stakeholders might be. But imagine, like we did with the Google exercise at the beginning, imagine it's 5 years from now and they are raving excitedly about you. How did we get there? How did it happen? And putting ideas on the table really from
Actually,
a
we could
happy
leave that open
future
so they can
state
get there. We should leave that open so they can get there.
is, Jenny, I think you need to
Oh, sorry,
mute
excuse me.
for a moment.
I did not.
Not at all, don't worry. Don't worry. So I think taking those different stakeholder perspectives is a powerful thing. But another one is even taking different company perspectives. I have found that pushing people outside of their existing mental models by, what would Disney do if they were here in our shoes? What would Apple do? What would Starbucks do if they were here in our shoes? So why do I say that? Apple, if they were tackling our challenge, they would think about simplifying the whole ecosystem and going for solutions people never knew they needed. How could that apply to us? Disney might think about using technology in cool ways behind the scenes. How could that apply to us? And others, Starbucks might think about customization and personalization. How could that apply to us? And just taking some of these different perspectives or personas and nudging ourselves in that way can be a really powerful thing. So I can keep going and share 2 or 3 other ways of getting new ideas on the table, but these are some of my favorites that I use with clients all the time. I'm happy to pause again. Questions, reactions, challenges, most welcome.
I mean, to me, Alan, this is fascinating. Thank you, first of all. But to me, the difference between corporate and nonprofit world is, we're constrained with our mission statements, right? So we've had a few situations where someone is coming with something innovative, and then we all read our mission statement and we're like, oh, well, we don't really want to change the mission statement, right? So that's, that to me is the most glaring difference. And then I guess the question is, how important is it to you to push to go outside the box or the definition of what you're supposed to be doing and serving?
I think it's a lovely reaction. Thank you, Maureen, because I think that I actually have a workshop this afternoon with a nonprofit based in New York that's really focused on vision and mission and how might we want to reinvent it. And I think if I understood correctly, what you described is actually, well, it's something that I see in corporate world as well as in nonprofits. People saying, well, no, this is who we are. This is the way we do things. We can't change our mission. We can't change our vision. Of course, the nature of the mission itself is different in the nonprofit world. And one of the things I took away from the Willie Peterson session, which I joined a few weeks ago, was this fundamental shift in mental model from, why do we call it not for profit? What if we call it for benefit instead? Who else defines themselves? But it's just a beautiful example of this first exercise on the page of changing our mental models. Mm-hmm. I guess my reaction then, Maureen, is that there comes a time for any organization, whether nonprofit or corporate, when it is the right moment to change a mission or vision and how we do things. Timing is everything, though, right? And so it's not every year, it's not every month, it's not every 2-3 years even. It's a monumental thing, and it's an important thing, and it's a serious thing. But I think the moment does arrive, whether in the corporate or the nonprofit world. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and then the other side of that is then selling this, since we have donations specifically earmarked, right, to sell the pens and not the lighters. Then the question is, wow, then how do you rebrand without having donors? It's a big audience. It's different, I think, than sitting in a corporate board, and you get to make these decisions, and that's just the decision. So to me, that's the big challenge.
I think related to that is a very fundamental problem about the structure, not for every single nonprofit, but in general, is that the people who consume your services are not the people who pay for them.
Good point.
And that leads to a lot of distortions. Are you delivering what your customer really wants? Do they value it as much as you value it? It's just a huge distortion relative to the corporate world, where if you're not delivering what the customer wants, that really fast.
It's a beautiful distinction. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, Jenny, I was just going to say, that what you and Maureen both just said is so true. And I find people kind of forget when you're getting this pushback of like, well, that's not our mission. That's not in our mission statement. Guess what? You can rewrite your mission statement. You're allowed to do that. But people are like, but that's not what our mission statement says. And then on terms of the funding, like, because Maureen, we talked about this like right before you came on, I think, of like when you change the mission and the donors are lined up for X versus Y, what I hear from our clients, the best way you get donors to agree to that shift in the mission statement is to convince them it was their idea. So you lay everything out for them. Oh, what shall we do? What shall we do? And then if they think the idea is theirs, they're more likely to go along. But it's super, super hard when you've been given money to do X to convince people that it's going to accomplish the goal so much better if you would let them repurpose it to do Y. I mean, it's really tricky stuff. I go back to Alan, so the head of the BCG New York office participated, Jeannie, in our, thanks to Alan made it possible, participated in our nonprofit best practice governance summit last fall. And she's on the board of Girl Scouts. And she said that, she and BCG have been trying to convince the Girl Scouts for quite some time that they needed to sell the cookies online. And the Girl Scouts would have no part of it. And, here she is, the head of the BCG New York office. She knows what she's talking about. Pushed and pushed and pushed. They just could not make progress on that. And then boom, pandemic hit and there was no choice. And obviously it's been very successful for Girl Scouts, and Jeannie is a genius. And yeah, I thought it was a great example she gave us.
It is indeed. It was a really powerful, and it's another example of how there's a lot of these analogies, even in the corporate world where, there were a lot of companies thinking about home delivery, thinking about how to get closer to the customer, and nonprofits thinking about how to reinvent themselves before the pandemic, but the pandemic drastically accelerated a lot of those things, especially in the nonprofit sector, I could argue. Cool. All right. All great points. Thank you for raising them. I'm going to share my 2 or 3 more favorite ways for getting things on the table, and then maybe wrap up with 4 cartoons. It's probably a good way to close things out. So let me share this thing again and project. So we've been through 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 5 is about technology specifically. And the idea is we are all seeing all sorts of new forms of technology batted around, facial recognition or attribute detection, smart devices, AI, drones, whatever you want, tons of these things. And I have a whole pile of these cards. And it's sometimes powerful to just think, how might this form of new technology apply to us, apply to what we do? In the nonprofit world, again, thinking about how new technologies could impact healthcare organizations, could impact food delivery organizations. There's a lot of interesting possibilities we can open the door to. And sometimes thinking about technology deliberately in this way can be useful. Another one is really about business model innovation. And we have observed a lot of archetypes of business model innovation. Nonprofits or for-benefit organizations have business models as well. They're sometimes different, but if I just define it quickly, the point I'm making is every organization has 6 very specific components of their model. Basically, who are we targeting, whether they're customers or stakeholders or beneficiaries? What are we selling, and how do we get paid for it, whether it's directly or indirectly, as we were getting at? And then in the bottom, this operating model is how are we set up and organized? What is our cost structure, and what other capabilities do we have digitally or otherwise? The claim I'm making then is that business model innovation means changing multiple ones of those things at once. In other words, if you change one of those things, basically you keep doing what you're doing, but you change the pricing, or you keep doing what you're doing, but you target some new beneficiaries. That to me is business as usual. Business model innovation is changing multiple ones of these things at once. And so the classic example is going from a yellow cab to Uber, where they changed certainly their business structure and their cost structure and their digital capabilities. They also changed the pricing model. And you could argue even that they changed which customers they targeted, at least at first. But anyway, the point is they changed almost all of these, at least 3 or 4 of them, maybe 5 at once, even if the core offering of getting from point A to point B was the same. So it's a beautiful example of pulling multiple ones of these levers. That is business model innovation. And we have a bunch of archetypes that we've observed. This is a busy BCG slide, but the point is there's a bunch of archetypes and examples of business model innovation. And it can be a really powerful thing to say, all right, how might this archetype of business model innovation apply to us? What if instead of selling a product or a service, sold an experience or an outcome? What if we became the organization that had a premium for sustainability? We had a reputation for sustainability. How do we want to play in an ecosystem? How do we want to think about unlimited services for the same cost? Anyway, the point I'm making, not all of these will be relevant to every organization, whether corporate or nonprofit. But sometimes taking a few of these and thinking, oh, how might a subscription model apply to us? How might selling an outcome instead of a product apply to us? How might an ecosystem setup apply to us can be a really powerful thing. And I'm happy to share these slides and some of that stuff anytime through Cynthia. And so, please.
I was just going to say, so by selling an outcome,
about to chime in.
Can you give us an example of selling an outcome?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to give you one from the corporate world, and then we can brainstorm what might be in the nonprofit, because I have some ideas. But in the corporate world, basically, GE was selling aircraft engines for many, many years directly to airlines. And then in the end, switched to selling power by the hour, where they were basically selling engine uptime by the hour, and they would be in charge of all maintenance and whatever else instead of the airline having to do it. But they would just sell by the hour instead of this thing. There are many photocopy companies like Xerox in your office or other offices that sell by the page, and they still own the machine instead of actually selling you the machine. So things like that. Mercedes will sell some of their trucks by the kilometer in Europe instead of actually selling the truck. So when we think about it in the nonprofit world, I can imagine thinking about, well, okay, maybe we're selling an experience or an outcome in some way, like food security or academic milestones, rather than hours of tutoring, or I don't know what, I'm making it up a little bit, but one can imagine thinking about selling an outcome rather than a specific product. Does it help?
Yeah.
because the last, the seventh, you know, my favorite is the classic improv, the yes and, building on each other's ideas. And so whenever we're doing something, you know, it's a question of what else, and how can we build on these things? So, you know, we could have a 45-minute brainstorm just on the sort of product to outcome discussion and how it might apply to this organization doing arts education in the Bronx, or that organization doing the Girl Scouts or whatever else. So, acknowledging that some of you may have to dash in 4 minutes, why don't I, since I promised I would, close with 4 cartoons, and then I'm happy to stick around and chat or answer questions or whatever else might make sense. But this one I love because it's just a reminder that whenever we're trying to work with people and get them to be creative, it can sometimes be useful to invite them to be a little bit like these astronauts and be open to surprise, be open to shock, maybe a little bit. In other words, be open to challenging mental models and seeing things differently. Because for me, when I think about what creativity actually is, you know, we all have years, decades of experience connecting the dots, and that's a really powerful thing. Creativity, though, I would argue, is actually connecting the same dots, the same information in new ways. And that can be a really powerful value add, a really powerful thing that you as board members, that we as business leaders bring to the table in this sort of thing. And so I guess the claim I'm making is that if you are ever with an organization or a team that seems like they're doing a ton of work, but the end result is looking exactly the same as where they started, it's a beautiful moment to step back and maybe try that from to exercise inspired by the low-cost airline, and just think, which of our existing assumptions might be ready for a change? Which of our boxes might be ready to be challenged? How can we come up with new possibilities in this? And if you can manage that with the organizations, then you won't end up like this poor despondent fellow who is upset because he's imprisoned, he's stuck, but he doesn't realize that actually he has the power to stand up and walk away. And the claim I'm making is that that is how we all are as human beings. We get stuck in these mental models that says, this is how we've always done it, or this is how everyone does it, or this is our mission, or we have no choice, or this is the, but to actually find the right moment to nudge and stand up and walk away from some of those assumptions, which might not be as set in stone as we thought, you know, that can open the door to a lot of fantastic new possibilities and a lot of things. So let me try and wrap it up there. I will just leave contact information here for whoever is interested, whoever wants to read the book in a different language. But the main point is I'm happy to share some of the material. I'm happy to send copies of the book. I'm happy to do whatever is useful. But from my perspective, let me just pause there, and whoever has to dash, totally understand. Whoever has more questions, happy to chat.
Alan, that was so incredible. I'm like kind of itching to get off the phone now or the Zoom and like sit with my pad and start thinking. Like, you totally fired me up. That was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was very
I'm
useful.
delighted.
Thank you, Alan.
Delighted.
Yeah, I agree.
Alan, thank you so much. And the one key question I had at the end was like, how do you sell these concepts in? And thank you for addressing that, because that's hugely important.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to this sort of thing, my most common approach in the corporate world is, well, this is part of a growth project. This is part of a strategic planning project. This is part of, you know, how do we think about the future given all these uncertainties that are swirling around a project? And all of that, I think, applies in different ways in the for benefit sector as well. I think that allowing ourselves to think about the right kind of growth, to think of new ways of reaching the same people, or new ways of achieving our mission, or rethinking our mission when the time is right, to allow ourselves to think about how to deal with 10-year plans and uncertainty and all the rest. You know, I think there are a lot of similarities, and some of the learnings in terms of business model innovation or whatever else I've said can apply across both sectors. So anyway, thank you for the thoughtful questions and chiming in throughout. I've really enjoyed some of it too.
I have a question, which is, you know, in the corporate world, sometimes people talk about forming, you know, an office of innovation or an officer responsible for innovation. Do you think that works?
I think it's neither necessary nor sufficient. In other words, I think sometimes it works, but I think it only works if it has enough independence from the mothership or whatever you want to call it. I think that it works if people are allowed to be empowered and to challenge the status quo and to look at things differently. And if that's really your goal, to empower people and get them to look at things differently, then okay, sometimes this Office of Innovation can help, but it's not strictly necessary, and it's certainly not sufficient. So I have no objection to those things if they're done right. I don't know, does that help?
Seems antithetical to me. I've always thought you kind of bureaucratized something that is inherently not bureaucratic.
Voila.
I'm just wondering if anybody, but I've heard of some good examples. I've heard of Toyota having, you know, allowing people to second themselves to labs to work on an idea for a long time, like for a year, not just an afternoon, and that working.
Or Google in the early days giving people 10% of their time to devote to their passion projects. You know, things like this can work if they're done with the right incentives for people to challenge the status quo and look at things. But
You froze.
Alan, you froze. Oh. Okay. I think we well,
Chart.
isn't it great the way the timing worked? Oh, he's back. You froze for a minute, Alan. We were saying you
Sorry.
were perfect
Okay.
the whole hour. It was just at the very end. So it was good timing, maybe a sign that you guys, thank you so much for your time today. Alan, really, that was just, we are all so fired up. And you guys, if you do anything with your nonprofits that is amazing because of today, come back and let me know so I can be sure and tell Alan, because I know, you know, as somebody who's a board matcher, it's always so amazing to hear, like when somebody from BCG we put on a board and they do something great. So, you know, we all live for feedback. And yeah, I know you guys are going to do amazing things because what Alan taught you today, and Alan and I want to hear about it. So on that note, you guys have a great day. Alan, again, thank you so very much.
Terrific.
A pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.